Thank you, Iman. We were waiting for you to introduce us again. We like our egos to be stroked in that way. No, thanks very much. And it's a privilege to be here, so thank you for the invitation. Just to repeat, my name is Simon Fremantle. I work as a political economist for Standard Bank. We have Gulam Balam. It's an unenviable task to moderate a panel in which your boss is one of the attendees. Standard Bank's chief economist, of course, Teto Nyati from Eskom, and dialing in Christina Duarte from the UN. Thank you so much for joining. We had a flutter earlier where the connection to Christina was not working, so we wondered whether we would have a rerun of this morning's challenges. But here we are talking about the geopolitics of the just transition. I felt it would be a very important topic in contextualizing our conversation in South Africa and Africa more globally. Geopolitics and politics generally is determining so much in terms of the risks that we face, in terms of the opportunities that emerge. Crispian's just spoken about the GNU giving us a fighting chance of creating economic recovery and institutional recovery here in South Africa, and that's not different for other markets in the world. As you all know, I'm sure, this year has an unprecedented array of elections. More than half the world's population is voting this year. The procedures around these elections vary in their credibility, but that in itself produces various opportunities for governments to emerge that are more or less supportive of the just transition and the climate conversation more broadly. So that's what we're going to try and grapple with here. I'd like to start with you, Mteto, if you don't mind, and just looking or considering what Crispian has spoken about, the global forces that South Africa has to navigate itself within, but also just looking very specifically at Eskom. We spoke a couple of weeks ago about the challenges that we face here in South Africa in making sure we have enough electricity while still sustaining our commitment to the targets that have been established. And last year, in the very intensity of the load shedding that we found, there was a tension there that emerged around whether we can commit while still providing a reliable source of electricity. It seems that has somewhat resolved with the lightening of load shedding, but I would love your appraisal on where you think we are now in that journey, and specifically around that apparent tension between what is required to power our economy and the commitments we've made to the just transition globally.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for that introduction. When you look at Eskom, we, as the board, together with management, we really never questioned the commitments that have been made by South Africa to the world. We never questioned that. We never we felt that we needed to also contribute towards making sure that we get there. It was never it's either this or that for us. We felt that we need to make sure that we are aligned to that, but at the same time, let's focus on making sure that we deliver energy security. So one of the first things that happened when we brought in the new CEO, Dan Marukane, who is now leading Eskom, one of the first things that we had to do, because out there in the media everywhere, there was this tension that clearly it looks like this board of Eskom is moving away from these commitments that have been made. So we prioritize helping him to go and engage some of the international partners. And I was one of the people that was tasked with the responsibility of introducing him into US partners, UK, French colleagues, and also the EU. The reason why I'm mentioning this is that in all of those discussions, what Eskom was communicating there was that, first and foremost, fully committed. The fact that we are delaying the decommissioning some of the plants to 2030, it does not take away the commitment that we have made. And everybody, once we sat down with them, was 100% behind the path that we have chosen. In fact, they felt that it is the right thing for us to do for South Africa. So that commitment is there. If you look at the work that we have done, we've already done some work at Komati, where we're decommissioning Komati. And we use that as a pilot to try and get a sense how best to handle this just an energy transition. And there were so many lessons that came out of that. One of those lessons is that don't wait until you have decommissioned and then you start the process of other projects, because the communities around have been impacted, and these projects take a long time to ramp up. You know, you can actually decouple the execution of the move to renewables to the decommissioning of the power station. So that's one of the big lessons that we took out of Komati, and that's what we are implementing now. In fact, we are not waiting for these power stations to get to the end of life. We are already implementing some of the projects today. And that's how, all of that came from the lessons that we got from Komati.
Thank you. I mean, I'm drawn to what one of the statements that Crispian made about how if you don't manage those transitional aspects well enough, then the politics of it all comes unstuck. I mean,
Yes.
that was what he said.
Yeah.
And my mind went to Komati, so I'm glad you've raised it. And I'd like to just tease that out a little more, if you would, is, last year it seemed as though Komati, almost the cart had been put before the horse, and there was, the community had not been brought along. What has been done since, and is there a way of emulating a better model for other decommissioning projects?
Look, if we are just honest, Komati was never really part of the just energy transition. It was part of the decommissioning that we always do in ESCOM. Decommissioning of plants is something that we do, but it was only much later in the process that, hey, why don't we, you have got this plan, why don't you also just include the just piece into the plan? So when you look at the lessons that we learn, is that we should not have necessarily handled it like that, but it gave us great insights as to how best to do things. So for me, those lessons will serve us so well as we look at other power stations going forward.
Thank you. Gulam, if I can bring you in. So Crispian's given us a very erudite overview of the geopolitical forces at play, but this is something that you've written and speak about a lot. So give us your sense of how energy and the just transition in particular is at the intersection of these geopolitical tensions, and also the main risks that emanate from the geopolitical fluidity that we see now.
Simon, thank you, and greetings to everybody. So maybe if I could posit my remarks within two dimensions. One is to seat the conversation surrounding a just energy transition within a broader global multilateral moment. And the second is to talk about what we're going through as a supply side crisis. Now, we're living in an epoch that has echoes of the 70s and the 1980s, to the extent that following the last 30 years of moderate multilateralism, in other words, fairly benign international relationships. Yes, there were some elements of tension, notably, say, between the United States and China in latter years. But for the most part, there wasn't an elevated geopolitical risk premium. And this decade, and likely the ensuing decades, we're now entering a period of multilateral contention. And I say that there's echoes of the 1970s and 80s in terms of the geopolitics, in the sense that that era too was defined as a contentious multilateral era. And it was triggered in the early 1970s with the oil crisis. So there's another common dimension with regard to what we're going through right now, in a sense that it's about energy systems. So in the early 70s, the Arab nations suddenly emerged in what was a bipolar world, and they harnessed that which lay beneath their soils, and they held it back from the United States. And as a consequence, the United States saw an end to its era of prosperity. And it was contentious. New voices suddenly emerged on the geopolitical landscape from what, as I've just said, was a bipolar era. And now we are living where there are more voices around the world, shaping themes such as energy. Many more voices as a function of the ascendancy of emerging markets in terms of their economic thrust. But that then also leads us to the second point of a supply side crisis. If we look back to the early 1970s, because of America's dependence on oil, which really gave life to middle-class living. Cheap oil in the 60s and in the 1950s, one could say is the source of today's elevated levels of hydrocarbon dependence because, as I say, of American industrialization, consumer goods in homes, durable goods in homes, and middle-class life. But that oil crisis effectively gave thrust to the search for new oil basins. So the Gulf of Mexico, the North Seas, Alaska. It also gave impetus to coal. And earlier on today, we heard that 80% of the world's energy or thereabouts is still reliant on coal. And that's Asia, because in the midst of the oil crisis of the 1970s, and on the back of Asia's ascendancy, it was disproportionately coal dependent. But the point is the supply crisis in the early 1970s, as I said, gave flourish to the search for oil, gas, coal, intercontinental pipelines, more latterly shale gas. So a supply-side crisis is different to a demand-side crisis, because when there's an absence of demand, it typically can be resolved within a few quarters, if not a few years, by, for example, lowering interest rates and engaging fiscal stimulus. A supply-side crisis, as in the 1970s, as is the case now, is solved by investing in new infrastructure, in new supplies. It took approximately 2 decades for some semblance of the United States to achieve energy security. So it was the 70s and 80s before the United States had some sense of energy security, not yet a net internally dependent. That would only come this century. And so it speaks to the nature of the current crisis that's also likely to be multi-decade. Multi-decade in the sense of searching for new sources of energy, this tilt from fossil fuels to renewable energy, and also, fortunately, in an environment where there's a great deal of new technologies, where the frontier of new technologies across an array of socioeconomic dimensions. And I think it's going to have very meaningful impact in getting us closer to the tipping point. But I can talk about that a little later. That was too generous in opening remarks. So just to say, I think those are the sort of my 2 opening dimensions in manner in which we can think about our current era of climate change within an environment of a supply-side crisis with echoes of the 70s.
Thank you, Ghulam. Christina, if I could bring you in. Earlier today, on another panel, Professor Swilling spoke or mentioned the UN Summit of the Future, which I'm sure you were involved in various ways. Within the geopolitical landscape that we now face, and as Ghulam has touched on, the end of an era of US-led unipolarity, and we're now in an environment where we know there's multipolarity, but the rules of the game appear to be in flux, and we're not sure who exactly is going to script them. And Africa has a greater voice. The pact seems to finally give some resonance to Africa's calls for greater representation in governance systems and calls for a change in global financial architecture and the like. But please share with us your sense of Africa's contribution at the summit itself and how you see Africa collectively and as well as some of its individual states locating themselves within the geopolitical landscape we're in, and perhaps specifically in the context of climate change and the transition as well.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Protocols observed. Greetings to everybody. Allow me to start very quickly for saying that the title of this session is a debate that is really critically important for Africa, because geopolitical dynamics, in my view, have been preventing Africa of, despite being a continent rich in energy sources, has been a continent in the dark. So Africa has been captured by a sort of energy paradox, I would say 40, 50 years ago, And one of the reasons or cause of this capture by Africa, by this capture of Africa by this energy paradox, rich but a dark continent, one of the reasons are, of course, the geopolitics. Allow me also to start the best way to convey UN's position on this, on the theme of this debate. Allow me to very quickly quote the Secretary General, and I'm going to quote from his remarks that he delivered, I would say last week when opening the what we call the General Assembly high-level week. He says, the Secretary General, very quickly, a future without fossil fuels is certain. A fair and fast transition, not. I would repeat, a fair and fast transition, not. You know that next year, the next COP, or next year COP, countries are supposed to put on the table new NDCs. And he made a call. He said these new NDCs that will land on COP next year, say these NDCs must bring national energy strategies, sustainable development priorities, and climate ambitions together. And they must align with the 1.5-degree limit. Then he goes and he delivers a quite strong statement from an accountability standpoint. By 2035, on average, advanced economies must slash energy emissions by 80% and emerging markets by 65%. The G20 is responsible for 80% of total emissions. They must lead the charge, keeping with the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Why I'm quoting this particular paragraph from SG's remark? Because it is my understanding that the parties of the conference have not embraced this principle at all, of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the light of different national circumstances. And the fact that the parties of the conference have not embraced this principle, this energy green journey has become a process full of contradictions and incoherences, which explain why we have not been delivering what we are supposed to deliver, the 1.5. And these incoherences are not coincidences, but they reflect exactly the current geopolitical setup, which, in other words, by design. How this impacts Africa? I believe, in fact, the global narrative has been putting Africa, what I have been saying, in a green energy straitjacket. And you are so big for straitjackets, by the way. Creating, in my view, an unsustainable trade-off situation between delivering the NDCs and delivering development. This is, I would say, the first incoherence of contradiction. The second one, the green energy straitjacket, as everybody knows, requires huge upfront investments. Huge upfront investments is the nature, let's say, the profile of the sector. But at the same time, what we see, that the international capital or financial system makes available essentially quasi-commercial and commercial lending. In a continent that everybody is trying to put it in a green energy straitjacket with huge upfront investments, in a continent where the majority part of the countries are not investment-grade countries. So the global narrative tells Africa you need to go fully green, at the same time not creating the conditions. And the numbers speak by themselves. Africa's renewable energy investment between 2010 and 2020, so 2010 and 2020, 10 years, $55 billion, representing 2.4 only of global renewable energy investments. those global renewable energy investments have been $2.3 trillion. If we narrow in Africa, this 2.4 is concentrated on North Africa and Southern Africa, on investment-grade countries. That basically are. So the global energy, as we speak, the global renewable energy investments have been 40 times higher than Africa's share. Then comes the third contradiction. The planet's future, as everybody, remains at risk. But yet, globally, many countries keep the status quo regarding energy consumption. Instead of meaningful and deep cuts in emissions, the conversation revolves around alternative solutions for carbon offsets, carbon markets, and providing hefty subsidies. So we need to deliver 1.5, but no credible mutual accountability and mechanism has been created. And this is the reason that after 28 COPs, we still having not. The question comes the fourth contradiction. So no mutual accountability from work. From a geopolitical standpoint, and as far as Africa is concerned, the question should be how the absence of a credible mutual accountability framework and mechanism has been impacting Africa's development options, paths, and policy reform. And this credibility has been affected. So the absence of this mutual accountability has been affected particularly by some shifts in the global narrative, as everybody knows, that starts emerging in a strong way with COP26. If you analyze how the global narrative has evolved from COP26 until now, it's full of contradictions, full of incoherencies, but at the same time putting a lot of pressure, let's say, on Africa. So from an African standpoint, I do believe that the African Union's position and African member states' position is very clear. Africa does recognize that we all, the planet, we all have the same destination, a green planet. So the same responsibility too. But Africa is asking to the international community to recognize that Africa has a different starting point. We have 600 million people without electricity, and you are about to conclude the first quarter of the 21st century, where and when other countries are already dealing with artificial intelligence. At the same time, Africa has 600 million people without electricity. At the same time, Africa needs to generate on an annual basis or 18 million jobs, and is only generating between 3 and 5 million. So I do believe that it's fair and just to recognize that the only viable energy future for Africa is a balanced energy mix. And to do that, each African country should be entitled to undertake its own energy plan, define its own energy mix, driven by energy access, not energy transition, but keeping at the same time that Africa needs to contribute to a green planet, and keeping at the same time that Africa has a different starting point. Otherwise, will not be able to deliver the Agenda 2030 and the Agenda 2060. Back to you, please.
Thank you, Christina. I mean, your comment of Africa being put in a green energy straitjacket is a very powerful one. I have one follow-up question before I come back to Mteto and Gulam, is just going back to the summit, and your call is a very clear one for the kind of energy mix that is required in Africa, but it requires Africa collectively, as well as some of its more powerful states, to make those claims and demands very prominently, and for them to be heard, and for governance and financial systems to respond. Do you feel as though space is emerging for those voices to be heard more clearly now? It seems to me, peripherally at least, that there is a greater acknowledgement of Africa's need to be part of all of these considerations, but I'm also conscious of what you say about a lack of the country's inability or unwillingness to embed the principles that they are speaking of. So where do we sit in that juncture?
First, allow me to say that the Summit of the Future has been a success, a huge success. Why? For a couple of reasons. First, allow me to mention that saw a true multilateralism functioning. What I mean by that? The Summit of the Future, as I used to say, generates a true consensus, not a cosmetic one. Because what is the difference? Allow me, the multilateralism, generate cosmetic consensus and true consensus. Cosmetic consensus is one everybody aligns by the least common denominator. Everybody agrees. How come it's possible for everybody to agree when you have such strong geopolitical tensions? Inequality has increased in the past 40 years, inequalities within countries and between countries. The social contract has been broken everywhere. How come it's possible? The only way is to align by the least common denominator. The Summit of the Future proved it in a different way, because there were disagreements. But out of these disagreements was a quite heavy bargaining and negotiation process, where Africa was able to craft a quite significant space, which is good. Because the multilateral system that does not allow Africa's voice to take its entitled space is a cosmetic one, is not a true one. And you need to be very careful not to crowd out Africa from multilateral geopolitics and then claim that multilateral system is working. Because if we crowd Africa, we are in a silent way contributing to the erosion of the multilateral system. And I believe that every member state needs to keep this in mind. Second, the Summit of the Future, as the Secretary General said, of course, was not a conference to solve all the problems, because this is not possible. Geopolitical dynamics are historical dynamics. But the purpose of the Summit of the Future was to create a fertile ground to increase awareness to the need to design, to structure, to activate an inflection point. Otherwise, the bill down the road will be heavy for everybody, developing and developed countries. And I do believe that that common idea, that common framework, that common ground in terms of the imperative to structure, to activate an inflection point, is the main outcome out of the Summit of the Future. Because when you recognize the need to design an inflection point, at the end of the day, you are recognizing, maybe not explicit, but in the case of the Summit of the Future, explicit, that we need to activate this inflection point so we start caring more about future generations. Third, in Africa, there is this tendency to put the 54 countries, African countries, in a basket. They are so different. They are so different. And to address your question in terms of deliver energy needs that Africa needs to deliver development, at the same time contributing within its quota of responsibility to the green planet, we need to break another paradox that Africa has been captured in the past 40 years. And this is the financing paradox. And I will finish here. Africa has been captured also by a huge financing paradox. Allow me to say that Africa loses $500 billion on an annual basis. And me and my team, we have the breakdown of this number. I don't have time to provide you. $500 billion on an annual basis, which is a flow, not a stock. At the same time, you have this same continent, begging for ODA, begging for debt reliefs, and begging for debt suspension. This is a paradox. This is a huge paradox. As we speak, Africa already financed more than 75% of its own development. But the mindset is a mindset driven by ODA. So this paradox needs to be broken, not only for Africa, of course for Africa, but for everybody. Because as Africa, the financing needs of Africa are huge, huge. Where is the money? The money is with the UN system, you know. The money is with the national budgets developed or the developed countries or developing countries now. Where is the money? We need to understand where is the money. When you understand where is the money, you will understand that to get the money to deliver the two agendas, the risking is critical. The risk is critical. Don't ask me this conversation if the Africa's risk is more perception than reality. I worked for almost 7 years in the banking industry, financing industry with Citigroup. And allow me to tell you, as soon as I perceived the risk, for me it was reality. And I would activate all mitigants, all exit outs. Is this perception? This is reality. So there is a need to de-risk Africa. And I believe in this process of de-risking Africa is where the UN 2.0, the huge reform of the Secretary General, embracing data, knowledge, foresight, behavioral science, you name it, wants to position the UN system in the pole position of helping African countries to the risk, stop losing the $500 billion, and start tapping international capital markets in a much better position, not issuing euro bonds with a 1 year grace period, 10 years maturity, interest rates of 10% to finance current expenditures. Does not make sense, but to create policy space that I think is what has been missing in Africa. Sorry, I think I took too much time. My apologies.
No, thank you. Thank you very much. Those are fascinating comments. And I am encouraged that you believe the summit was a success in an environment of such geopolitical, ideological contestation and bifurcation. For countries to come together and find some agreement in the midst of all of this it could ultimately turn out to be some form of that inflection point that you refer to. I want to bring it to a slightly different, but of course related level. Mteto, so there's this idea that I don't have, but there is an idea that certain countries, certain entities within countries, given that great power rivalries that are playing out, have to make a decision or a choice over which of the allies they seek to align themselves to. I don't think such a choice is necessary. I don't think any country can be forced to make that choice. I would rather argue, and many others have as well, that there is opportunity in not choosing. And for Eskom, you've got the Just Energy Transition Plan on the one side, and then in the middle of last year, an agreement was signed on the sidelines of the BRICS summit for some assistance with Chinese companies to refurbish or work on Eskom power stations. And that felt to me an indication of the ability not to make a choice one or other direction, but to be able to use South Africa's position in these geopolitical, in this geopolitical environment to gain access to both streams of political and economic influence. Would you agree with that? And how do you see that playing out within your realm of influence?
Yeah, I think it would not be wise for Eskom to make some choices and say we're aligned to this or aligned to that. And we need to take a cue from what our own country has decided to do in terms of its own foreign policy. Our foreign policy it should be, and it is, I think, not non-aligned, and from that, I think it's actually a wise position to be that. Of late, though, if you look over the last 3 or 4, 5 years, you would see that we, as much as we say that we are non-aligned, but our actions were saying something else, right? But when I look at what has happened in the last trip the visit by our president to the US, I'm actually encouraged. I'm encouraged because our relationship with the US is as equally important as our relationship with the BRICS, as it's important with our relationship with EU. We need to be driven by our national interest. And this changes from one issue to the next. And so to align ourselves with one group at any point would actually be shooting ourselves in the foot. We need to continue to have options. And that's the same view that we have taken as a company. Most especially, just look at the issue of nuclear. We cannot box ourselves and say, hey, we are all going to be aligned to people that are in the BRICS countries. We've got a number of countries that develop nuclear. You know, we've got France, we've got the US, we've got, of course, we've got Russia. We need to do what is right for South Africa, and we also need to do what is right for Eskom. You know, and in doing that, you need to keep our options open. So, as a company, our view is very, very, very clear. We are driven first by what's right for South Africa and what is right for Eskom.
Thank you. Gulam, so when, of course, as a research team, the research team that you overlook, we analyze and we consider the trajectory of various African economies. And this debate is one that's relevant in varying degrees to all of the markets that we function in. What would you say, given what has been mentioned by Christina and some of those very clear, some of the very clear emphasis on the need for a de-risking of African economies, the need for a different conversation about how Africa approaches these challenges? Where are you seeing the most acute challenges and risks as well as opportunities in the markets that we function in?
So, Simon, that's a very wide question, so allow me to maybe framework it within a few dimensions. Within the continent, about a third of the continent still lives in dire poverty. A very similar percentage of individuals on the continent cannot read and write. And astonishingly, about 58, 59% of the continent is still rural. Its inhabitants are still rural. So that speaks to the enormity of developmental needs. Let's refer to that as the demand-side equation of people wanting access to prosperity, and energy is a very powerful transmission channel. It's the oxygen that can generate economic activity. We've been speaking abundantly of financing, and it alludes to the notion of suboptimal investment. The way we think about this investment is within two frameworks, two paradigms. There's underinvestment and there's catch-up investment. By underinvestment, we note that over the last 13 years or so, from 2014, there has been underinvestment in energy systems worldwide of about $1 trillion. Relative to 2014's level, had that been maintained in terms of preceding levels of growth rate. So there's been energy systems investment neglect for, let's round up and say, a decade and a half. So the supply crisis is one of a shortfall of energy around the world, not just in Africa. It's also layered by the complexity of the desire for energy independence in Europe away from Russia for obvious geopolitical reasons. Then when we shift to the idea of catch-up, if we were to go back to peak energy intensity, the highest level of energy consumed to produce 1 unit of GDP was 1971, rightfully just before the energy shock and before energy intensity began to decline notably. In 1971, let's say prosperous America was consuming 70 times the quantity of energy per capita in a year relative to emerging markets, as we now know them, because then they were still least developed. So there's a substantial gap between the rich world's consumption of energy per capita and developing economies, and even emerging economies. China has caught up. 30 years ago, it was shallow. It was under 10 gigajoules per capita. Now it's about 100, compared to in excess of 300 gigajoules per capita in Western nations. So we're attempting to talk about sizable amounts of capital while we're addressing underinvestment of more than a decade combined with catch-up. And catch-up that is almost automatic in the sense that we want to see development, and with development and per capita income gains on the continent or everywhere and elsewhere, people increasingly consume more, and they consume more discretionary items. And one of the discretionary items that people would like to enjoy, especially as income improves, is travel. And international travel or local travel, but certainly aircraft travel. And that's fairly intense. So we're facing a path over the next, say, 2 decades of substantial need to compensate for the neglect and underinvestment for a decade and a bit, to the extent that we will continue to see Asia develop, and we'll see Africa also grow at, say, 3 to 4% per year. There will be per capita income gains. There will be an increase in the gigajoules per capita from fairly substantially low levels. And so it's right that when everybody talks about the amount of capital that's needed, it is going to be gargantuan amounts. But I sometimes, and if I could be a little bit challenging, some of the discussion has been about risk. It's been about banks and banks' appetite. But preceding bankability or commerciality is consideration surrounding political stability. Political stability and its close cousin, accountability and governance frameworks and the rule of law in societies. These are the prerequisites to confidence, and confidence inviting animal spirits to then join with banks and correspondingly invite risk capital into an economy. And the contradiction for Africa, perhaps in my very amateur summary view, is we house 16% of humanity, but we account for about 4% of GDP. So that speaks to the gulf in terms of our prosperity deficit. It speaks to also our dependence, historical dependence on fossil fuels, and why per capita we generate more. But we're coming from such an incredibly low base. And I guess the synonym for just is judicious. And there is this very encouraging tilt to recognize that Africa's path to prosperity, and if you remember what I said in 1971, the Western world and America was consuming 70 times. So in other words, today's climate dimensions are a function of their last 50, 60 years of carbon-intensive joy and socioeconomic prosperity that they enjoy, that we're now having to calibrate for. And so I will conclude with just this. I'm encouraged by the signals that there seems to be constructive dialectic taking place when the forums that matter. And I say that I'm pleased about that, because instead, this era we're drifting towards is one that is fragmented. From the globalized world of the last 30 years that was largely intertwined with respect to people capital and people mobility, capital and goods and supply chains, the world is fragmenting on ideological lines or on geographical lines. It is also fragmenting on supply chain lines. So in other words, who do we align to in this active non-alignment approach is that we're still looking for capital from the West, financial capital. But we're sourcing our infrastructure from the East, because the Eastern nation, and China in particular, dominates with regard to renewables, infrastructure, and hardware. And so there's a bunch of contradictions amidst an attempt to calibrate for judiciousness. And Africa's elevated voice and the type of UN interventions are crucial. If we're going to get a global solution, even if it is within the confines of climate, even if we don't get a global solution and a single entity convergence with regard to the other areas of global tension and geopolitics.
Thanks, Gulam. The next question is probably an unfair one, but Crispian's not here, so he can't answer it. But he mentioned in his remarks that he feels the US election is perhaps not as influential in terms of determining multilateralism and specifically commitment to climate commitments as some would assume. Certainly my assumption is that it has the possible implications of being extremely disruptive to the kinds of processes that we've spoken about over the course of today. Teto, I'm not asking for Eskom's view specifically, but when we engage, of course, with corporates, multinationals, as well as South African companies, there is an increasing need for all companies involved or engaged domestically and internationally to pay heed to the kind of geopolitical and specifically the political changes in some of the most pivotal economies in the world and what they may imply or what those risks, what kinds of risks may wash up on our shores. So I wonder what you think about that and the possibility of another Trump presidency in the United States. Is it something that concerns you in your current role? And if not, feel free to just bat the question back.
Look, I think if we can end up with a Trump president, we understand what will that mean. To me, what it will mean is that we'll have a US that is more focused on itself and less focused externally, versus if it was somebody else. So, but that has got implications for economies like South Africa, for regions like Africa, because as we all know that we need to get out, we need to continue to be driving this agenda of growth, both for South Africa and the growth for Africa. And in order to do that, you need partnerships. You need the investments that are related to that. And if you are going to be having less and less of that and having more of an economy that is looking at itself, inwardly looking, that is going to be negative for our region and certainly negative for South Africa. We also do know how he feels about countries like ourselves. He called them things that I cannot repeat here, and if this is how the person thinks, of course we know that the individual in companies do not necessarily follow that they are independent, but certainly will influence how they consider, they think about our geography. So for me, I would say that we need to pay attention to what is going on there, and it will certainly have an impact one way or the other on us.
Yeah, I mean, I was at a Chatham House conference soon after our elections here, and I was just struck by how every single delegate there, from the United Kingdom, from the United States, from most of the emerging powers as well, spoke about the uncertainties and risks that are presented by a possible Trump presidency. The uncertainties perhaps even more worrying, because you just don't know how it'll unfold. But thank you very much for sharing that.
May I just throw one-liner? So Paris 2050 is by voluntary participation. With the United States committed to Paris 2050 and assembled with the other partners that have also so subscribed, effectively 89% of the world's economies, when measured by greenhouse emissions, are committed to Paris 50. So quite simply, if the US withdraws, if the US is non-participant, at least at a political level, it's clearly a very substantial withdrawal from that very substantial 89%. But I guess the mitigating factor is that what happens at the political level in the US clearly matters, but I think some level of mitigation is in the sense that multinational America, corporate America, I think will be more sensitive to climate dynamics, and so we could get a constructive fissure between headline political tilt and corporate America's subscription to the idea of climate responsibility.
Thank you. That's a crucial point. I think often one lost in the South African conversation about our bilateral relationship with the US, and Teto, you spoke about that. earlier, and how that some assume that cascades down to every level of US-South Africa interaction. There are 600 American companies here that aren't going to take their line of march necessarily from the US government, of course. Christina, can I bring you back in on this point, but any others that you've heard over the course of the past 10 or 15 minutes that you'd like to speak on, but really about that commitment of key economies to multilateralism and how that may be changed or reconfigured depending on what might happen in the US elections later this year, and what kind of risks that poses to the fertile ground that you spoke about earlier that we require to be able to redesign systems in a more equitable way.
Thank you. Very quickly. Allow me to use some concepts of geography. We all study that when geographical tectonic plates move, these are moments of profound disruption. What we are experiencing now are not geographical tectonic plates, but are geopolitical tectonic plates, are moving clearly. And of course, associated to that, we have profound disruptions in all dimensions. In the past decades, I would say almost more than 100 years, let's say these days, we moved from a bipolar economic order or geopolitical order to a unipolar in a very, I would say, silent way. But when that unipolar was landing, behind that, a multipolar started emerging. And as we speak, we are now in a multipolar world. If the multilateral system organization, not only the UN system, but the Bretton Woods institutions, you name it, do not reflect the multipolar world, we should not approach that the reality doesn't exist. What is real is the multilateral system, let's say, set up and establishment. That would be, in my view, would be a very quite strong analytical mistake. We have a reality that is a quite deep and strong consolidation process. Multilateral system is now trying to understand, trying to adjust, and these are the disruptions. Of course, our challenge is to minimize, to contain disruptions so they don't cause too much human being suffering, human being damage. Have you been able to do so? I don't know. And I think that this is our challenge. And I hope that the next 20 years will be better than the past. Back to you.
No, thank you. And I think you're absolutely right that the multilateral systems have to reflect the multipolar world. That is a very powerful way of putting it. I realize that we're down to 7 minutes left, and I haven't given an opportunity for the audience to ask any questions. So please do raise your hands if you do have any questions that you'd like to pose to the panel. Otherwise, we do have some on the screen, which I can check. Is there one? Okay. Audrey.
Thanks, Simon. Audrey again. A lot of attention has been paid to the US election, upcoming election, and that's probably right. But we might be missing something around what's happening in Europe. Yeah. Because if you think about it, Europe has really been leading the charge on the climate agenda and that narrative. But Europe is changing. And if you think back the last sort of 12 months, in election after election, we've seen the so-called far right emerge victorious. Most recently, I think Austria. In France, we would have had a far-right government if the other parties hadn't cobbled together an election, a coalition really at short notice. So my question is, or my thought is, what's happening in Europe could potentially be even more disruptive than what we're seeing in the US, because even when the US withdrew, in the first Trump presidency, Europe sort of continued the charge around the climate agenda. So just thoughts from the panelists around that. Thank you.
Thanks, Audrey. Ghulam, would you like to respond?
It's a very sound observation. Since 2010, the number of political parties that occupy the far right space has doubled with respect to its occupation in parliaments, in government. I have to say, though, and I'm not supportive of the undertone of how much of the right-wing parties come to power, particularly with respect to xenophobia. But what tempers my concern a little bit is that in some of the countries that you've mentioned, what we've noted is that when parties that tender their credentials initially on the back of perhaps anti-immigration stance, they tend to walk back some of that zeal once they're in government. If we look at Italy as an illustration, where Italy has gone through successive governments and where coalitions have in fact proven to be more roiling than stabilizing. The current Italy administration, which did emerge on right-wing sentiment and appealing to more conservative Italian voices, you've actually had a reasonable level of political stability emerge. Again, I'm not endorsing the undercurrent upon which they emerged, but noting that Italy seems to be on slightly more stable political footing, and with it, a semblance of greater economic coherence in terms of internal political policy making. And so I won't want to subordinate this lurch to the right and the increasing representation of right-wing parties, and also how centrist parties have to tilt to the right to be more acceptable and to an evolving constituency. I think it'll phase in the sense that these nationalistic policies will prove to be dampening of the broader European project. And the broader European project, which has delivered prosperity, is one of integration. So I think there will be this tension in Europe between the European Parliament and the progressives that appreciate that integration across Europe, that the Maastricht Treaty in the early 1990s was monumental, along with the euro as a currency, in engendering European prosperity. And this internal and inward-looking tilt, combined with border policies to, for example, monitor immigration, will be resisted internally from, let me say, core architects of the European project and European Parliament. So this lurch is there, the tilt is there, and you're right, but I think there are also some internal checks, some internal mechanisms that even if it doesn't reshape the European landscape to a more progressive stance that we kind of knew 10 or 15 years ago, I think the lurch will not be as extreme as the headlines would suggest, and I think not as destructive as we think it might possibly be at its worst.
Thanks, Ghulam. We have a few minutes left, and there's a question that I do think we should get to on the board, which is, Christina, you spoke earlier about the need to de-risk African economies, and certainly in order to allow greater access to financing in particular. Ghulam spoke about the necessity of having foundational political stability. How do you view the nexus of those two aspects in Africa? And what kind of steps need to be taken practically for that de-risking process to take place? And again, I'm not referring to Africa as one entity, of course. I don't commit that ultimate sin. But of course, there is a need to look at certain regions, and the political stability equation in some is more pronounced or more risky than others. But just that nexus, and your thoughts on that as we close off. And then, Mteto, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you for your final comment to close the panel.
Very quickly. Political stability, let's say instability or conflict in Africa. Me and my team have the responsibility we are the penholders, let's say, of one of the Secretary General reports that he submits to the General Assembly on an annual basis. And this report is the cause of conflict in Africa. Our main responsibility is to go beyond short-term interpretations and analysis and try to understand the root cause of conflict. And in the last 4 years, our main conclusion is that the root cause of instability in Africa is the absence of the state. Is the absence of the state. The state is not there. No social service, no public goods. You have the nation with the territory. It does not control the territory. It leaves untapped and creating a fertile ground for non-state actors. What is that with let's say, de-risking African countries? That same absent state that feeds instability and conflict is the same absent state that loses $500 billion on annual basis. That state is absent because it does not provide public service, social service, public goods. That same absent state, again, loses $500 billion. So we need to link the absence of the state that has been feeding instability and conflict in Africa to the financing pattern, rich but begging and losing $500 billion. We know that when I used to work in the banking industry, let's say in this way, I had a lot of titles. But if you ask me what was my main function, I was a cash flow chaser. I was chasing for predictable cash flows to spot a landing a business opportunity. Or if a continent loses $500 billion, means that he has the capacity to generate cash flows, economic and financial cash flow, but not the ability to retain them, to keep them. My question is, should we factor this when assessing risk in Africa? Yes. What is the missing piece of the equation? Country systems. Africa has no domestic resource mobilization system. So I do believe that, yes, the de-risking process of African countries needs to recognize or acknowledge that there is a deep homework to be undertaken. Nation building, state building, country systems, institutions. At the end of the day, institutions as intangible assets do matter to deliver development. And development is the only way to deliver durable peace. The only way. Everything else is band-aid, sorry. The only way to deliver durable peace is by delivering sustainable development. But to deliver sustainable development, you need sustainable finance. But to generate sustainable financing, you need to be able to control your economic and financial flows. If you do not control them, you are not able to deliver sustainable finance, because sustainable finance does not come with ODA, FDI. No. These are just marginal flows. So at the end of the day, even from a de-risking standpoint or from a conflict instability standpoint, we narrow to the same point, the need to have effective states in Africa. And as we speak, the absence of the states stop serving the capitalist system, which is maybe an opportunity. Back to you.
Thank you very much. Teto, I realize you're also seeing the flashing lights.
Yes.
So I'm sorry to put that kind of pressure on you, but I would love you to comment in closing. Political stability, we sit, and I know this has been spoken about today, in an environment of a degree of political stability that we've been yearning for some time. Long may it last. But any final contributions that you have, and again, I would like to echo what Sim said earlier, and just thank you for your contribution to creating the kind of institutional stability that Christina has mentioned, and which I agree is so essential for us to move this conversation forward.
Yeah, so my final thoughts is just listening to the discussion. This is not an area that I'm comfortable with. Something that, just listening here is fascinating for me and learning. But what I can say is that we should avoid seeing ourselves as victims. I'm talking now as a region, we should avoid, going around trying to, it's like begging. We need to be much more assertive in our approach. We've got so much to offer as a region. We said a lot about the critical minerals that we have, so much that we can offer. We need to start to look at what is it that other people need, and how can we leverage that to get to where we want to go. But the starting point for the region and also for the country, we need to be clear about what is our national agenda, what is our regional agenda, and once we are clear with that, when we engage with whoever we're engaging with, let's connect, let's drive our agenda. So that's my final thoughts. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, Christina. Thank you very much, and Teto and Gulam as well. Thanks.